Who will be the DCU's Batman? That's been the question in every single DC fan's mind ever since James Gunn and Peter Safran announced they would be building a new DC universe. And well, who could blame them? Even though Superman was a great film, Lanterns looks great, Millie looks ridiculously fun as Supergirl, Clayface seems really interesting, and Man of Tomorrow has an extremely exciting concept. The fact of the matter is that Batman remains the biggest character DC has, which even James Gunn himself admits, going so far as to call him the most popular superhero in the world. Just the past year he was the character that sold the most comics, and throughout the decade he stood firm as the DC character with the best films, shows, video games, and comics. Everyone has an idea of who their ideal Batman is, and those that haven't seen that version realized into the big screen feel this might be their chance to finally see it. And even the people that have seen it, whether it's Keaton's, Kilmer's, Clooney's, Bale's, Affleck's or Pattinson, are still extremely curious to see whether a new take can match their personal favorite or if they can hate on it freely. Being an autist with Batman as their special interest, I share the exact same curiosity. So much so that it became a recurring hyperfixation of mine for the past 3 years, leading me to create an Excel spreadsheet listing 188 different actors that could potentially be next Batman, which I've used to narrow down 6 candidates who I think have a strong likelihood of landing the gig using 4 different criteria. Who are those candidates? How did I narrow them down? Well, you're about to find out. Before all that, let's lay the groundwork. What do we know so far about the DCU Batman? Well, his debut is currently slated to be on Brave and the Bold, a film where Batman will be coming into contact with his actual son, Damian Wayne, who in the comics is the 5th Robin. This admittedly doesn't give us a lot, but it does allow us to go onto our first criterion, the age range. And to start off with this, we have to say that none of us knows what the exact age range will be, not even James Gunn himself, as last time he was asked about it, he only reiterated that stuff like that was still in flux. And then specifying that even things like the when and how Bruce becomes an actual father are still to be decided. But this does give us enough to play with to at least assume that whoever the DCU Batman actor ends up being, if they follow the comics timeline, which I tend to think they will since the whole family drama aspect of it gives room for a lot of narrative possibilities, has to be someone that can believably play a father figure, and probably more than a father figure, a patriarch, as Damian Wayne, and the early promise that the film would introduce members of the extended Bat family would seem to imply the existence of at least some of the previous Robins, who by that point would not be teens or preteens anymore, but rather young adults that also look up to Bruce as a father figure. This would rule out the prospect of a very juvenile Batman, and with that, actors that are very baby-faced or very young looking. However, this does not necessarily mean it will be an hyper-mature, Dark Knight Returns type of actor either. A fair age range, I would say, would have to be around 35 to 45, with enough leeway to go 3 years above or below. That does narrow the list down somewhat, but not enough. So let's go on to our next point, height. This may seem like a ridiculous point to some. After all, didn't Robert Downey Jr. wear platform boots as Tony Stark? Doesn't every Tom Cruise film use tricks to maximize his height? What about Lord of the Rings? Well, maybe for some filmmakers height isn't that much of an issue when it comes to casting, but for James Gunn it very much is. It's been a recurring staple of his casting, with James even going so far as making a Twitter thread about how important height is for him and getting into a nasty fight with Anson Mount about it. Now there's a guy we can confidently rule out for the DCU Batman. For Guardians he even dismissed Jaemon Hongsu for drags over his size, even though he was only a few inches shorter than Bautista. And if you look at his casting calls, you can see over and over again a recurring pattern of height being a massive consideration when it comes to casting. Lex Luthor had a height requirement. Superman similarly did, judging by how every single one of the 3 actors that ended up screen testing were over 6'2". Brainiac had a height requirement. Presumably Maxima has a height requirement. And if you look at all the prominent male character roles in the DCU, you can see a pattern in which everyone is tall as hell. David Corenswet and Nicholas Hoult are around 6'2" to 6'4", according to celebheights.com, and so is Aaron Pierre. Nathan Fillion and John Cena are 6'1". Eddie Gattei and Kyle Chandler are both around 6 foot to 6'1". I very much struggle to think of a scenario where James, having this amount of consideration when casting for height, would proceed to cast a Batman that looks small next to every other male character in the DCU, so I think it's fair to narrow height to 6 foot plus, with preference for the taller side, which rules out some popular fan cast names such as Jonathan Bailey and Jake Gyllenhaal. And by the way, even though this may sound like a stupid point to some, I actually do agree with James' rationale here. While one can do those sorts of forced perspective tricks or whatever to get around the height thing, the fact of the matter is that blocking a scene, setting up a shot, is already hard enough, especially on movies as complicated as this, with characters in all sorts of insane scenarios and crazy costumes. To have to do that, not only for one movie, but what would have to be across different movies, potentially even shows, sounds like a nightmare. It's much more practical to find a taller actor to fill the part, especially since there is no shortage of great tall actors to play Batman anyway. The next bit of criteria to narrow our list down is one that's somewhat harder to quantify than height and age, but one that's very much worth keeping in mind anyway. Whoever it ends up being, it will likely be an established actor. And by established, I don't mean famous. I just mean someone that's at least gotten some sort of leading role or important role in something. It could be a streaming show no one watch, some indie drama, something. This isn't about fame. It's more about the general concept of probability. If you're an actor in your 30s, have been acting for, let's say, 10 years, and you haven't gotten a leading role or important role on anything, and have mostly just had really tiny supporting roles or glorified extra gigs, what are the chances that the first leading role you land is, of all characters, Batman? Is it possible? Maybe, but not very likely. Also, I think it will probably be an actor that at least has some promise or momentum behind him. Someone that's made an impression on something, a show, a movie, whatever. They have some factor that has made them stand out. I know that Tom Rhys-Harris, who got cast as Matt Hagen, seems like a total newcomer to people. But even he had a few prominent roles in British TV shows prior to getting cast in Clayface. And even Brainiac's actor, Lars Edinger, was a very prominent actor in Germany, especially in the theater. The last point is the most important of them all, but it's also the most subjective one. In fact, I don't even know exactly what to call it, so I'm just gonna go with the simplest term I can think of for what I'm getting at. Vibe. This sounds vague as hell, but for me, this is actually about going to the core of what makes a Batman casting work. Even so, you can't really say there is one specific phenotype for Batman actors in live action, like you could say there is for Superman, where most of the actors that have played him look like they could be related to one another. I would argue there is a specific feel they all generally share that makes each and every single one believable as either Batman or Bruce Wayne. Whether it's the elegance that they all manage to capture to sell the aristocratic nature of the Prince of Gotham, or, though this last point might apply less to Clooney, whether it's the quiet intensity, the vulnerability, word wariness that makes them believable as the man behind the cowl. I would say that even a take as different from modern Batman as West had that too, with his Bruce having an extremely fancy, gentlemanly voice that made him extremely charming to watch and that grounded an otherwise extremely wacky world, and with him often delivering his lines as Batman with utmost sincerity and seriousness in a way that captured a stoic, intellectual nature that still feels extremely true to the character to this day. Whoever gets cast needs to be someone that can capture those two sides. Their specific hair color, eye color, face shape, or whatever can all be very flexible, but they need to have that. It has to be someone that you see and hear both as the billionaire playboy that Bruce is and the vengeful creature of the night that Batman is. It has to be someone that is able to capture the inherently haunted nature of the character when you look into their eyes. I would also add that because this is a Batman that will be coming to a world with metahumans, it also has to be someone that can be completely available as having the type of obsession and commitment that would lead a man to be able to stand toe-to-toe with superpower beings and command a lot of authority and respect. Especially if they take notes from Grant Morrison's Batman run, as James said they would when they announced Brave the Bold. Someone as believable as a person that Superman could call the most dangerous man in the world, that can be an intellectual equal to Mr. Terrific and Lex Luthor, and could easily knock Guy Gardner down with one punch. One caveat here though is that because the DCU has so far been very traditional when it comes to the casting for the big roles, with James often getting actors that seem ripped straight out of the pages of the comics, I also don't really think he's gonna be taking any massive swings in the looks department in the same way someone like Burton did with Keaton's casting. Josh O'Connor and Adam Driver are, for example, very good actors that would otherwise fit some of the criteria listed here, but do I, in my heart of hearts, think that James would look at either of them and think, yeah, this is my ideal Batman right here? No, not really. Now we're down to 49 names, and out of these 49, I'm gonna single out the 6 that have the most going for them, whether it's because they have the most career momentum, some sort of connection to James Gunn or DC already, or they just seem promising as actors in ways that make them easy to take seriously as Batman candidates. Starting with Lee Pace. I'll say it right away, he is my personal favorite. He is the oldest one mentioned here, having been born on March 25th, 1979. So depending on exactly what age range they settle in, he might be out of contention. But then again, he is the same age as Eddie Gattegi, and Mr. Terrific, like Batman, is supposed to be peak human potential physically, and he is younger than Adam Fillion, John Cena, and Kyle Chandler, so I wouldn't rule him out yet, especially considering how we all know exactly what they have planned for Batman at the end of the 10-year plan. So for all we know, the plan could be for Batman to either retire or die, and the mantle to be inherited to Dick or Damian, which would make the idea of casting for longevity pretty pointless. Having worked with James Gunn before, and having expressed interest in playing the part, he stands a pretty good chance at getting cast if they are willing to offer someone his age range, and he would be absolutely perfect. He's shown a lot of range over the years across multiple different projects, being able to go from funny to dramatic to imposing and menacing and everything in between. But it is his role in AMC's Halt and Catch Fire as charismatic salesman entrepreneur Joe McMillan that proves he has everything it takes to take up the mantle of the Caped Crusader. There you can easily see how he would be able to play all the different shades of Bruce Wayne, from the charming billionaire playboy to the cold, calculating vigilante, to the broken man that remains a kid stuck in crime alley, to the complicated, troubled, yet well-meaning ally that tries to connect with those closest to him despite him and the way he operates landing him in trouble more often than not. with a deep baritone voice that he knows damn well how to use, and a theatrical background having studied at Juilliard and having done a couple Broadway plays, he reminds me a lot of another Batman actor, perhaps the most iconic one in the fandom's eyes. Kevin Conroy, the man who played Batman in the DCU, the Arkham games made by Rocksteady, and several animated films. It is the exact Batman that I can easily imagine Lee portraying better than anyone else. Imposing at 6'5", firm. It's easy to imagine him walking into a room filled with metahumans and imposing much the same way that Batman imposed over them in the DCU or the JLI comic series. Easy to imagine him delivering speeches and monologues to his many different proteges. Easy to imagine him charming his way into fancy galas as Gotham's most elegant bachelor, and able to stand his ground around the other big players in the DCU's corporate world as the important figurehead of Wayne Enterprises. Lee feels like he was almost born to play the role. His piercing blue eyes are able to convey so much without him needing to say a single word, and he has such mastery over his own physicality and the way he presents himself toward the audience that with just slight movements he's able to communicate a tone, which is, useful for a character that mostly wears a mask. All the other names I'm gonna mention are promising in their own ways, and if picked, I've got no doubt they would do a good job, but I still think that no one would do a better job at playing the part than he would. I can also imagine him playing really well opposite David Corenswet, as their similar classical training as actors in Juilliard could be enough to cultivate a dynamic that would be fun to watch. He is definitely the actor I would personally pick. Then we go on to Benjamin Walker, born June 21st, 1982, an actor I sadly can't speak too much about, as most of his career highlights seem to lie on the theater. But it is there where he's made a name for himself in a way that makes me take him into serious consideration, having been nominated for a Tony Award, the Broadway equivalent of an Oscar. Peter Safran is a fan of his work, having cast him in a movie many years ago and citing his on-stage performances as the reason why. It is the exact connections that make me think he could enter in contention. 6'2", deep voice, could be a good fit and could enter the screen test stage if he puts it his all in an audition. Also, he played Patrick Bateman, which historically has been a good precedent for Batman castings. Oliver Jackson Cohen is the next one, born on October 24th, 1986, having gained a ton of notoriety for his roles in Haunting of Hill House, Haunting of Bly Manor, and as the titular character in The Invisible Man, he definitely stuck in the minds of the fan casting community as a suitable candidate for Batman ever since, and it's easy to understand why. Especially throughout the Haunting series, he showed a respectable amount of range, going from playing a mild-mannered traumatized drug addict to a charismatic roguish fiend. Both roles had him performing really complicated emotional scenes, which he pulled off extremely well and made for some of the most memorable moments in both shows. In Invisible Man, he plays a sociopathic and manipulative executive, and despite only appearing briefly in the films and he is, invisible, he definitely makes an impression. The one thing that makes me kinda wary on declaring him as a shoo-in is mostly the fact that he's talked about how he doesn't feel comfortable in hypermasculine, imposing, stoic type of roles, even saying he feels like he wouldn't be a good fit for Bond. But depending on what the approach for Batman is, he could still fit regardless. At 6'3", he would also stand pretty well next to Corenswet. Paul Anthony Kelly is the next one. Born on October 20th, 1988, standing at 6'2", a height identical to Batman in the comics. A newcomer that I've been keeping an eye on ever since he got cast as JFK Jr. on FX Love Story. It's always been incredibly wild to me that a real-life Bruce Wayne existed back in the 90s, but no one talks about him. A handsome playboy that appeared in every single tabloid of a big metropolis that was also a tragic public figure, pursued by the media since he was a child, even as he was dealing with immense loss. Not only that, but the real JFK Jr. looked identical to a lot of Bruce Wayne depictions. So when someone that very much looked like him got cast to portray him in a big TV show, I was immediately interested. Well, almost a year later, it seems like I was certainly up to something, cause the show released, and not even a week after it premiered, everyone began fancasting him as Batman. In a very rare turn of events, every corner of the DC fandom united to say that he was the most Bruce Wayne looking guy they've ever seen. For good reason too, as he looks identical to the portrayals of Bruce in the comics by Neil Adams, Jim Aparo, David Mazzucchelli, and many others. He has that type of old-school Hollywood look that's very much missing from most actors nowadays, and for a first on-screen role, he's shown himself to be quite a capable actor and a charismatic presence. What especially struck me about him is the earnestness he portrays JFK Jr. with. He comes across as very natural, and is able to hit on the bits of vulnerability that his character requires. The sad glimpses into his eyes, the ever-growing enthrallment over his love interest Caroline. He doesn't play JFK Jr. as a caricature, but as a real human being, while still being very much able to evoke his real-life mannerisms and speech patterns. And while that may sound like something simple, it does require a real level of skill, especially when he's acting opposite actors that have a lot of experience under their belt, such as Juilliard-trained Sarah Pigeon or Academy nominee Naomi Watts. His performance in episode 5 did get some criticism due to some very poorly directed scenes, but with the level of talent and naturality in front of the camera he's shown in pretty much every other episode and every other scene, I've got no real reason to think he wouldn't be able to crush it as Batman with the right script and direction. And with James Gunn being someone that's been consistently able to get the best out of his actors like with Dave Bautista, John Cena, Jennifer Holland, Daniela Melchior, Chris Pratt, etc., and Will Powell bound to have more time to prepare for Batman than he had to prepare as JFK Jr., being cast only 3 weeks before they began filming, I think he would be in pretty optimal hands, and I would love it if he got the chance to play the part. He has an infinite amount of potential. The next two are the ones that I think are the most likely. In fact, I straight up wouldn't be surprised if the final screen test came down to those two. But before we talk about them, I would like to quickly list a few honorable mentions. Josh Hartnett, having sort of a career resurrection at the moment, with him getting a memorable role in Oppenheimer and a leading role in Trap, he does carry with him a natural charisma that would be interesting to see in the role of Bruce Wayne, and if they go older, he's one of the actors I can see being in contention. Having rejected the role of Batman before though, it's not entirely clear to me if he would even be interested in something as time-consuming as playing him in a connected universe, and I don't think he would be quite as good as Lee Pace, who he would likely come up against in that age range. Tom Pelphrey, a bit of an unconventional pick, but an insanely talented actor, maybe being the best of the ones mentioned. Someone that's always able to infuse his characters with an insane amount of personality, making him a delight to see on screen. I could easily see him coming up with a captivating take on Batman in an audition. Ethan Peck, known for playing Spock in the modern Star Trek TV shows, he carries with him a deep voice, a strong defined jawline, and a look that evokes some renditions of Bruce in the comics. He is someone that I can see entering in contention, especially as he's expressed interest in playing the part. Jacob Elordi, one of the hottest young stars at the moment, an Oscar-nominated actor with a look and career that fits nicely with previous Batman actors. I'm pretty certain his age would more than likely rule him out, and I'm also not especially convinced he would be interested on joining a connected universe like the DCU. Still, he did express interest in playing Batman before, and if they were to pull New 52 timeline shenanigans or Lazarus Pit rejuvenations, he's one of the few young actors that would maybe be able to sell the patriarch aspect regardless, just by virtue of how tall he is and how incredibly deep his voice is. Now we go on to the first of our two finalists, Brandon Sklenar, born June 26, 1990. Brandon has an insane amount of momentum right now, coming off his breakout role as Spencer Doron in 1923, one of the most watched shows of the past few years. He's gained an amount of notoriety that would be the envy of most actors working today, getting the romantic intro role in It Ends With Us, which for all its faults still made over $300 million, getting the male leading role in Drop, and another major role in The Housemaid, which was also a massively successful film that further cemented him in the public eye. It's pretty obvious that studios have their eyes on him, and for good reason. In 1923, he showcased a bunch of characteristics that are simply uncommon to see in actors of his age. A rugged, tough as nails masculinity that beyond falling flat still showcased a great amount of vulnerability. Being able to say a tone with a few words or not a single one, communicating entire stories in his eyes that perfectly convey everything his character was feeling as he was dealing with the pain of being a World War I veteran, and displaying a ton of charisma and tenderness that played extremely well for the epic love story being told in the show. He has a lot more range than people give him credit for, with his role on Mapplethorpe being extremely different from the other type of characters that have come to define him over the past few years. I'm still doing a great job in that. And while some people doubt that his look or energy would be quite able to match the aristocratic essence of Bruce Wayne, I do think that the short role he had in Westworld as a rich Wall Street type of dude proves he would be able to blend into those types of environments just fine. And his role in Housemaid proves he would be able to play a rich patriarch convincingly. At 6'3" and with a pretty deep voice to boot, it's no wonder he became a popular fan cast, especially since he's been very open about his desire to play him. And with James Gunn being a big fan of 1923, stating he liked his character there and loves him as an actor, he stands as an extremely likely candidate. And the same could be said for the next candidate, who I actually think is the likeliest of them all. I'm not a betting man, but if I had to bet, I would bet the role goes to him. Tom Brittney, who James Gunn has referred to as one of his favorite actors in the world. Born on October 26, 1990, he was one of the 3 finalists for Superman, and if reports are to be believed, then it really came down between him and Coren Sweat. His most prominent role has been in Grantchester, taking over from James Norton as the lead in season 4 to 9, playing Will Davenport, a kind-hearted vicar that nonetheless has his own demons to carry as the descendant of a wealthy family with a troubled past. So throughout the show, he mostly carries himself with a really charismatic, soft personality that makes it no wonder he was that close to getting Clark Kent. There are moments where he does showcase a type of intensity and moodiness that feels extremely well suited for Batman. And of course, that same charisma mentioned earlier can translate easily into a great Bruce Wayne. I would especially highlight Season 5, Episode 5 as an episode that showcases the depths of him as an actor. I can see why James is so high on him, and I would not be surprised if he ends up being the DCU Batman, as he has pretty much everything you could ask for a DCU Batman actor. Versatile, able to play things either really small or really big, able to communicate a lot with his eyes, able to impose when necessary, able to charm, really vulnerable, and he looks a lot like several depictions of Bruce Wayne. I would particularly highlight Greg Capullo's and Arkham Knights as ones he really evokes. At 6'2", he has the perfect height and well, even the fact that he kinda looks like David Corenswet can be taken as a plus, considering how many times Bruce and Clark have been portrayed as really similar looking in comics and animation. He is my second favorite, and I would be very happy if he got cast. But regardless of what the future holds, I do have one thing very clear. I have faith on James Gunn to make the right choice when it comes to who will portray Batman. He's consistently been great at casting, even when he's got to cast really complicated roles. Obviously, the major roles so far cast in DCU are great examples of that, but I would also put the casting of Frank Darbo in Super as an example, Rainn Wilson being an absolutely inspired choice for that film. And when you've seen how committed he's been to finding the right actors for all sorts of different roles in the past, from auditioning over 300 actors for Star-Lord, even passing on some pretty notable names at a time in favor of finding who he thought would be absolutely perfect, to discovering talent like Daliana Melchior, and putting an insane amount of thought and effort into casting Mr. Terrific, and even characters like Eve Tersmacher and Langston Fleury, I've got no doubt that when it comes to casting Batman, he's gonna go through whatever lengths necessary to cast the absolute best man for the job. I would also add that what makes Batman a tricky character to fan cast is the fact that, because he is such a specific character, it's kinda hard to envision what an actor will exactly do with him unless you actually see them performing. Even Kevin Conroy sounded different in the role than he did in his normal life, and Christian Bale's Batman voice isn't something that would have easily been predicted just by looking at him in his other roles. So could another actor that I didn't put as much focus on coming with a great audition and crush it? Could some of the actors I mentioned screw it up somehow? Sure, it's possible. Well, except for Lee Pace. I think he would be perfect regardless. And there's even some actors that are on my Excel list, but I didn't highlight, such as Francois Arnold and Leo Suter, that at a glance I feel like they could be realistic, but I can't talk about, as I haven't seen their work and I don't know much about them. I mentioned Adam West earlier, and I think he's a perfect example of how unpredictable these processes can be. For Batman 66, the role came down between him and Lyle Waggoner, an actor that looked like an exact replica of how Bruce was drawn at the time. Lyle was a good actor, physically fit, seemed to hit every mark well enough, but West, despite not looking like Bruce in the comics, brought something so unique and compelling to the character that it was a no-brainer to cast him. And it's those kinds of surprises that makes this sort of casting situations so exciting to watch unfold. What's gonna make this process exciting? This will be the first time in a long time that Batman goes through a proper audition process with many different actors of different notoriety being looked at for the part and taking their swing at it. So anything could happen. I'm just giving my 2 cents to highlight these actors that with the limited amount of info we have, I think are the likeliest. If you stuck around till the end, thank you. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment, like, hype, and subscribe, and I'll see you sometime next in this 21st century. Lee Pace should be Batman.